The winding road through the Oregon forest stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of cracked asphalt framed by towering pines. Autumn leaves swirled in the crisp wind, scattering across the truck's hood like fragments of a faded memory. Sarah Parker sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The smell of damp earth and pine needles seeped through the half-open window, mingling with the scent of old leather from the truck's seats. Behind them, 6-year-old Emily hummed softly, her high, airy voice almost lost beneath the steady growl of the engine. She clutched a worn, one-eyed teddy bear to her chest. David Parker, focused on the road, kept glancing at the rearview mirror, as if measuring the distance to something only he could see. They had driven nearly 5 hours to reach this place, leaving behind the cramped city apartment and the mounting bills that seemed to multiply overnight. David had insisted the move was necessary, a fresh start for all of them. The house had been listed for a suspiciously low price, but he called it luck. Sarah had called it desperation. The forest opened suddenly, revealing a small valley dotted with houses that looked as though they had been frozen in time. In the center stood their new home, an aging 2-story structure of weathered wood and peeling white paint. The front porch sagged slightly to one side, and the windows stared blankly, clouded by years of neglect. The truck rolled to a stop at the edge of the gravel driveway. Emily gasped with delight and unbuckled herself before either parent could stop her. She leapt out her boots, crunching on the gravel, and ran toward the house with unrestrained excitement. Her laughter rang through the chilly air, bright and pure against the silence of the valley. Sarah stepped out more cautiously. She hugged her coat tighter around herself as a shiver crept up her spine. There was something unsettling about the house, though she couldn't name it. It wasn't the decay or the silence. It was the sense of being watched, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Emily paused at the foot of the porch steps and turned back to her parents with a grin so wide it almost seemed unnatural. "Timmy's going to love this place," she said matter-of-factly before running up the steps. Sarah froze, blinking in confusion. She looked at David, who shrugged, tired and impatient. "Who's Timmy?" Sarah asked, forcing a laugh. "Just her imaginary friend," David muttered. "You know how kids are." Sarah tried to smile, but unease coiled deep in her stomach. Emily had never mentioned a Timmy before, Sashad. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking and cleaning. Dust drifted lazily through the beams of pale light that filtered in through the grimy windows. Sarah spent hours scrubbing, trying to erase the years of neglect embedded in the house. The smell of mold clung stubbornly to the old wooden floors. Emily spent most of her time exploring, talking, and laughing with someone who wasn't there. Sarah would hear her daughter's high voice drifting down hallways, always speaking as though to another child. At first, Sarah dismissed it as harmless. After all, imaginary friends were common among children Emily's age. But soon, Sarah began to notice strange details. Emily seemed to know things she couldn't possibly know: the location of a trap door beneath the living room rug, the fact that there was a rusted music box buried under the maple tree in the yard. Sarah asked how she knew, and Emily simply said, "Timmy showed me." One afternoon, while folding laundry, Sarah saw Emily sitting in the corner of her room, whispering urgently into empty space. Her small hands were clasped as if holding another's. When Sarah stepped closer, Emily abruptly stopped speaking and turned her head slowly, her wide eyes unreadable. "Who were you talking to, sweetie?" Sarah asked gently. "Timmy." Emily replied, her voice soft. "He doesn't like it when you listen." That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the house. The wind moaned through the eaves and the old floorboards creaked as though under invisible feet. She told herself it was just the house settling. But deep down, she knew better. On the third morning, Sarah was buttoning Emily's coat when she noticed a bruise blooming dark and round on her daughter's forearm. Emily. "What happened here?" Sarah's voice trembled. Emily looked down at the bruise, then back up with unsettling calmness. "Timmy played too rough," she said simply, as though it explained everything. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Sweetheart, there's no Timmy." Emily shook her head, almost pitying her mother's ignorance. "He's real. You just can't see him. When Sarah told David, he dismissed it with a wave of his hand. She probably fell. Kids do that. Sarah wanted to believe him, but the bruise looked more like a grip mark, as though small fingers had dug into Emily's flesh. That evening, while Sarah prepared dinner, the laughter of children floated faintly through the house. She froze, knife poised above the cutting board. Emily was supposed to be napping upstairs. "Emily," she called, her voice echoing through the hall. The laughter stopped abruptly. Sarah climbed the stairs, each step groaning under her weight. Emily's bedroom door was ajar. Pushing it open, Sarah found Emily curled up on the bed, apparently asleep. The room was empty and still, but when Sarah turned to leave, her gaze caught on the mirror across the room. For a split second, she saw a shadowy figure of a small boy standing beside the bed. Then it was gone. Sarah stumbled back, heart hammering. Her hands shook as she shut the door and fled down the hall. The next day, she decided she needed proof. While David was at work, Sarah bought a small security camera and installed it discreetly in Emily's room. She told herself it was for safety, but deep inside she needed to know if she was losing her mind. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat in the dark living room, eyes fixed on the live feed from the camera. Hours passed with nothing but the gentle rise and fall of Emily's breathing. Just as Sarah began to drift into uneasy sleep, movement flickered across the screen. Emily sat up, whispering into the empty room. Her small hands gestured as if playing a game. Sarah leaned closer, straining to hear. A faint second voice, colder and thinner than Emily's, answered back. Then the air in the video seemed to ripple. A dim, misty shape coalesced beside Emily, the vague outline of a boy about her size. Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The figure leaned toward Emily, whispering something inaudible. Emily laughed, a high, sharp sound that sent chills down Sarah's spine. The figure turned its head. For one horrifying moment, Sarah felt as though it was looking directly at her through the screen. The camera feed abruptly cut to static. Sarah sat frozen in the darkness, her pulse roaring in her ears. She could no longer tell herself it was all in her imagination. Timmy was real, and heat was inside her house. As the chapter closes, the narrator's voice lowers to a chilling whisper. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting tales like this, because what happens next will keep you awake at night. Morning arrived quietly, as if the valley itself wished not to disturb what slept within the walls of the old house. A pale sheet of fog lay low over the yard, blurring the fence posts and softening the crooked angles of the porch. Sarah Parker woke from a shallow dream with the sense that someone had been standing beside the bed, watching. When she turned, the room was empty. The heater ticked softly behind the drywall, and the window glass trembled faintly in a breath of wind. Emily was already awake. She sat cross-legged on the rug in her room, arranging bottle caps and smooth stones into careful circles. She worked with grave concentration, as if building a clock only she could read. The teddy bear watched from the pillow, its one-button eye catching the light in an accusing glint. Sarah noticed a second bruise on Emily's wrist, lighter than the first, the color of a fading plum. "Let me see," Sarah murmured, reaching gently. Emily drew back, not sharply, but with a calm certainty that stung more than any flinch. Her gaze slid past her mother to the corner where the wall met the dresser. It was as if she expected someone to step out of the seam of the house and stand between them. Sarah followed the gaze and found only dust and a hairline crack. Days developed a strange rhythm. In the mornings, Emily grew quiet, her attention pulled toward things the adults could not perceive. She ate slowly, chewing as if listening between bites. In the afternoon, she would roam the yard, finding small treasures that seemed to call her name: a bottle stopper, a rusty marble tin, a chipped blue cup. At dusk, she would stand at the edge of the yard where the grass surrendered to the trees, whispering into the shade as if reporting news to an unseen friend. Nights were an inventory of noises, rattles, breaths, the gentle pad of footsteps that had no weight. Sarah told herself to collect facts. Panic would be useless without evidence. She charged the security camera and checked the memory card each morning, cataloging minutes of nothing punctuated by splinters of impossible. Once a drawer rolled half open while Emily slept. Another time the curtains bellied inward, as if filled by the breath of a child standing close and sighing. The most damning was the faint outline of a boy seated on the floor beside Emily's dolls, head bowed, shoulders tense in the universal shape of a child clutching secrets. David tried to be kind in the way of a man building bridges out of practical wood. He fixed a loose stair tread, replaced the porch bulb, and bought a second-hand space heater for Emily's room. In the evenings, he cupped Sarah's elbows and said things about stress and transitions, and not feeding an imagination too much attention. Sometimes he sounded like he was reassuring himself. Sometimes he sounded like a man trying not to see a crack widen under his feet. On the 5th day, Sarah drove to the town library, a brick building recessed from the main road, as if embarrassed by its own seriousness. The librarian, a woman with a cardigan the color of old eggshells, led her to a corner where a microfilm machine lived in secular devotion. Property records old newspapers, the librarian said, lowering her voice not out of fear, but pity. People come every few years. They don't stay long. The reels whispered like insects as Sarah wound them forward. Headlines winked by school board elections, harvest fairs, flood warnings. The town documented itself the way a bird builds a nest, steady, practical, with the same scraps repeated until they became structure. Then the tone changed. The fonts grew bolder. The type sat closer together as if huddling. A photograph bled through the grain, a boy with a serious mouth and a bowl cut, one hand raised shyly toward the camera. Timothy Collins, age 7. Missing. The article spoke in careful language about last seen and any information and authorities' request. There was an early lead, then a dead end. There were volunteers, then fatigue. There were promises. There was winter. Further reels unearthed editorials about safety, polite anger about curfews. A page of candlelight photographs. A name appeared more than once. Walter Briggs questioned, then released, then photographed in profile as if the newspaper wanted the town to learn the edges of his face by rote. On a quieter page, a council budget item tucked beside a bowling league score. There was a smaller photograph, George Hill, newly appointed deputy, standing between two council members, his smile neat and careful, the sort that understood the weight of public trust. Sarah printed copies until her coins ran out. The paper came out warm and damp as if the past still carried body heat. She folded the pages into her tote and sat for a long time in the car watching a pair of crows argue over a pale wad of bread. Every town keeps its own weather, she thought. Here, the forecast called for silence. When she returned, Walter Briggs was in the front yard, kneeling by the maple with a pruning saw. The late sun burnished his gray hair into a thin halo. He rose slowly when he saw her wiping his palms on his corduroy jacket. From the porch, his features always looked assembled wrong. Up close, they resolved into something wearier, less certain, like a face practiced at being misread. "Tree's sick," Walter said, gesturing toward the curling leaves. "Rot climbs from the roots before anybody admits it. Then, one day a wind, and down it goes." He angled his chin toward the house. "You settling in?" Sarah felt the heft of the library pages in her bag. The words burned through the canvas like a smolder. She wanted in that moment to demand an accounting, to ask what he had been doing the night the boy vanished, to drag the past into the yard and let it blink into the light. Instead, her mouth filled with softer questions domesticated by manners. "Do you know much about the house?" she heard herself ask. "About the Collins family?" Walter's eyes flicked toward the upstairs window, the one that seemed to watch the yard like a squinting sentry. "Enough," he said. He hesitated. "Folks around here learn to carry things. Sometimes they carry them so long they forget to set them down." He pointed to the maple's exposed roots laid bare by erosion. "You can't blame the wind when the ground lets go," he added, and turned back to his work. The saw's teeth sang a quiet, rough note. Inside the house held a different temperature, like a breath drawn and kept. Emily had arrayed her found objects in a row along the hallway, each item precisely 2 handspans from the next. The precision felt like an answer to a question no one had asked. She looked up when Sarah stepped around the relic's eyes, clear and distant at once. "Don't move them," she said. "He likes them that way." Her voice carried no threat, only a fact, as if reporting the hour. At dinner, Emily ate 2 bites of chicken and then asked to be excused. She moved down the hallway like a small shadow unmoored from its body. The heater cycled on. Something thumped lightly in the bedroom upstairs, then again, then not again. David put his fork down and stared at his plate. "We need a routine," he said finally, as if a spreadsheet could anchor the unseeable. Charts, chores, bedtime at the same time. He named solutions the way sailors name stars, each a point to steer by no matter how far the water ran. That night, the fog thickened into a felted wall. The house retreated into itself. Sarah sat cross-legged on the living room floor with the camera feed open on her phone. The brightness turned low so the screen wouldn't glow like a beacon. For a long time, nothing happened. Emily turned, sighed, pulled the blanket over her shoulder. The digital clock slid from minute to minute, like a slow leak. Then, the air in Emily's room seemed to condense the way cold gathers on a window. The curtain lifted without a draft. Emily's eyes opened. She stared at the ceiling, then at the far corner, and smiled in a way she didn't smile at people. Her lips moved. The audio captured a whisper, but not words, like a shell held to the ear, promising ocean. Sarah switched to the previous recording, searching for a pattern. As she scrubbed through time, she noticed something she had missed, the figure when it appeared always settled near the same spot, the seam of wall and floor where Emily had first laid her circle of stones. The camera did not love the figure. It bent and stuttered around the edges as though the lens itself resisted the shape. Once the figure turned, and Sarah saw not a face but the suggestion of a face, a child's gravity without a child's color. She closed the app because her hands had begun to shake. The house listened to her breathing and answered with its own. She rose and went to Emily's door and rested her forehead against the wood. On the other side she heard the slow, ordered rhythm of sleep. She held the doorknob and did not turn it. Trust was a bridge she did not know how to cross, not toward her husband, not toward her daughter, not toward the world that had changed its rules without telling her. In the morning she took Emily into town for hot chocolate, a public ritual against private dread. The diner smelled of syrup and coffee, and winter coats hung too long on hooks. People watched the newcomer child with the polite interest reserved for weather fronts and yard sales. A bulletin board by the door held layers of paper-lost Pet's piano lessons, a fundraiser for new playground swings. Under the overlapping corners, an older poster clung stubbornly to the cork, a candlelight vigil photo. Its caption, sun-faded. Sarah did not touch it. She felt the urge to apologize to the face in the picture for not being here when it mattered. On the way out, she caught a glimpse of George Hill through the diner window, broad-shouldered, careful hair, the posture of a man who understood his presence was a kind of furniture the town arranged itself around. He laughed with a councilman, one palm lifted as if calming a horse. When his eyes swept the street and found Sarah, his smile intensified in a way that was not for her, but for the idea of being seen, being kind. It was nothing, and it made her cold. Back home, Sarah opened the folder of printouts and laid them across the dining table. The past looked orderly when flattened into columns, and yet it still refused to confess. She pinned a timeline to the corkboard she brought from the city using the colored pushpins Emily liked to sort by hue. Timmy's last day of school, the volunteer search, the abrupt drop-off of coverage like a cliff cut by an unseen tide. In the margins, she wrote questions she did not yet know how to ask. Who benefits from silence? Who polishes a story until the stain stops showing? The house creaked as if stretching. The heater ticked and then went quiet. Somewhere downstairs, a drawer slid open and then closed. Sarah turned slowly toward the sound, not startled, only very, very tired. She found Emily in the doorway, hair tangled from the wind coat unbuttoned, though she had not sent her outside. The child's eyes were bright, and her mouth had the set of someone who had learned a new rule. "He says the door in the floor is not a door," Emily announced. "It is a mouth." Then she walked past Sarah and into the living room, humming the tune of the music box that had not worked since the day they moved in. The words pressed a bruise into the air one only adults could feel. Sarah followed to the rug and lifted the edge. The trap door, if that was what it was, lay flush with the plank's old iron ring dulled by time. She did not pull it. Some knowledge required a witness. Some required a waiting. She replaced the rug and smoothed it with both hands as if tucking a child into bed. That night, as wind combed through the trees and the house tucked its chin into its chest again, Sarah sat at Emily's bedside and told a story about a lighthouse that kept shining even when the sea forgot its name. Emily listened awake, but far away the way commuters sleep with their eyes open. When Sarah finished, she pressed her palm lightly to Emily's crown and left the door ajar, the hallway light a small square of permission. On the landing, she paused and looked back. For an instant, she thought she saw a boy seated on the floor where the rug met the wall. His knees drawn up, his head turned toward the half-open door. Not menacing, not kind. Waiting. She blinked, and the corner was only a corner again. Downstairs, she poured water into a glass and watched the surface steady. The kitchen window threw back her reflection thinner than she felt, somewhere between the clock's second hand and the breath she had not yet taken. A thought landed and would not leave. Some hauntings arrive because a grief has nowhere else to go. And if you're listening to this, if you want the next piece of the story, when the quiet starts to speak, don't forget to subscribe. Sometimes the only way out of a dark house is to keep a light on between chapters. The weather shifted without ceremony, as if the valley had drawn a heavier coat across its shoulders. A fine rain threaded the morning soft as breath and just as invisible until it beaded on the windows. The house received it with a hush that made the rooms feel deeper. Even the pines beyond the fence seemed to lean in listening. Sarah woke to the strange certainty that a decision had already been made in the night without her. The feeling followed her like a draft as she moved through the kitchen, setting out cereal, warming milk, steadying her cup with both hands when the saucer trembled. The security camera lay on the counter beside the basket of fruit. She did not open the app. It felt suddenly like peering through the wrong end of a telescope, seeing more and understanding less. Emily appeared in the doorway with her hair uncombed and her socks misaligned. She walked carefully as if placing her feet on stones beneath water that only she could see. Her eyes were bright without being cheerful. She ate in silence, then slipped away the bowl, barely disturbed. The house accepted her departure like a secret returning to its pouch. David came down later, knotting his tie with the briskness of someone building a wall against uncertainty. "We can't keep doing this," he said, not unkindly. "Just tired." The word "this" did too much work. It covered the house, the fog, the camera, the bruises, the unspoken fear that had built itself a chair at their table. He set a file folder beside the fruit. "I called the realtor," he added. "If you're set on it, we can list by spring." He did not say, "I should have told you I knew about the story," because saying it would open a gate he was not ready to walk through. Sarah lifted the folder and closed it again. Spring was a season as far away as a foreign country. The rain held steady. The day pressed forward with the dull kindness of routine. Yet, even within the motions of the laundry and emails and the hum of the heater, the quiet felt strained as if some taut line were about to sing. By midday, Sarah took the folder of printouts to the dining table and arranged them by date. Headlines tumbled into a pattern: Timothy Collins' missing volunteer efforts continue, no new leads, community praise. The type darkened, then thinned, then stopped. There were no articles about grief because grief is a private country with strict borders. But there were photographs, faces tilted toward candlelight faces learning to accept that candles cannot call a child back. She taped a map of town roads to the corkboard and pinned a red thread from the house to the library, from the library to the diner, from the diner to the municipal building where meetings were held, and minutes were typed into polite rows. A blue thread ran from the house to Walter Briggs's yard, a distance short enough to measure in breaths. Walter's name on paper felt like a weight that had been set on top of something else. When she could no longer read her own notes for the blur of them, Sarah put on her coat. The rain had led up to a scattering of drops that fell from needles and gutters with the rhythm of a slowed heartbeat. She crossed the yard, keeping to the flagstones, and found Walter at his workbench under the lean-to. He was oiling a pair of pruning shears with the concentration of someone who understands how a tool holds memory in the hinge. He looked up only when she stood at the edge of the covered space. "Please," she thought without knowing whether the plea was for him or herself. "Say something I can trust." "Leaves'll mat if you don't comb them before the freeze," he said after a moment, nodding toward the dark lawn. "Rot's a patient eater." Sarah took a slow breath. "I read the old stories," she said. Her voice surprised her by holding. "I know your name is in them more than once." Walter set the shears down. Up close, his eyes were less like a suspect's and more like a man's who had learned to carry the same day over and over. "Town needed a shape to hate," he said. "Folks pick a person. Cheaper than truth." The rain tapped on the lean-to roof, a hand drumming without anger. "If I told you Sarah asked that he is still here, the boy, would you believe me?" Walter did not laugh. "I always believed him here," he answered. "Believing and liking are different jobs." He wiped his hands on a rag that would never again be clean. "There were things I saw," he continued, and his voice slowed into its own memory. Men at the municipal building late. Trucks at the edge of town that had no business in a town this small. A boy who waved to me one afternoon. He had a jar of moths. He said he liked how they tapped the glass like rain. I told the deputy. He thanked me so polite you'd think I'd brought him flowers. Next week, someone told the paper I was hanging around the school. Sarah recognized the name that did not need to be spoken. The deputy then had been George Hill. The sheriff now was George Hill. The town sometimes changed titles the way a person changes coats while the body stays the same. "Why didn't you leave?" Sarah asked, almost gently. Walter looked past her at the line of trees. "Because leaving makes the lie neat," he said. "Because someone should stand where the truth went missing." On the way back to the house, the air felt heavier, as if the weather had gathered into a witness. Sarah paused at the porch and listened. Inside, a half-heard melody floated and was gone the broken music box, trying one more note. She found Emily sitting on the hallway floor, stacking smooth stones into a small tower. The precision was ritual, not play. The tower leaned, then corrected itself as if corrected by an invisible hand. "He says the circle is better," Emily murmured without looking up. Her tone was a borrowed one. Sarah knelt. "What does Timmy want?" she asked, a whisper almost no louder than thought. Emily's hands stilled. Her face did not change, but something else moved behind it, a tide claiming a rock. "He wants not to be alone," Emily said. She lifted her gaze then, and the green of her eyes looked for a breath like the green of a deep pool, clear and cold, and far. Sarah reached and did not touch. That evening the valley's quiet broke. It did not shatter, it bowed. The phone rang. A polite voice from town, a committee chair Sarah had never met, asked if she and David might attend a small gathering at the municipal hall next week, a welcome to new families, a community evening with cookies, and a short talk from Sheriff George Hill about safety and belonging. The voice was smooth as polished wood. It carried the confidence of a person who has never had to shout to be heard. After she hung up, Sarah stared out the window until her own reflection dissolved into the dark. In the glass, the shape of the house behind her looked deeper, a tunnel more than a dwelling. She thought of the threads on her corkboard and how red lines sometimes meet not because of accident, but because someone drew them to converge. Dinner slid into the spaces silence leaves behind. When David spoke, it was with the steadiness of a man trying to hold the center. He mentioned budgets and overtime, the want of solid ground in a season of mud, the need for sleep. His concern came out disciplined, then frayed. He flinched when the upstairs drawer thumped once, then twice, as if in agreement with an invisible point. He rubbed his eyes. "We can't let this house get inside us," he said quietly. He meant this story, but the grammar would not admit it. Sarah pressed her napkin flat with both hands until a seam formed. Later on the landing, the argument found them because there was nowhere left in the day for carefulness. It did not come with raised voices. It arrived like a pressed finger, direct, unrelenting, leaving a mark after it lifted. Sarah spoke of the camera and the bruises, and a boy who wanted something no living person could give. David spoke of stress and moving, and a past that did not need to be adopted as their present. The words stacked until they weighed more than either of them could carry. Then David said the sentence he had been avoiding. He said he had known there was a story attached to the house, and he had not told her because the price was possible only because the past had made it so. He said he thought they could outrun a rumor. He did not say he had thought he could outrun his own fear. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was containing. It held the weight of a broken trust without spilling it. Sarah looked past him down the hall toward Emily's room where the door stood ajar like a mouth holding the shape of a word. There is a way the world changes in a moment so small it could fit on the head of a pin. The heater clicked off. The house exhaled. A draft moved along the floor, the kind that travels as a messenger rather than as air. Sarah and David turned in the same heartbeat. Emily's bed was empty. The blanket lay folded back with the neatness of a child who has learned to leave evidence behind only when she wants to be found. The window latch rested open by a fraction that can be the difference between inside and out. The hallway stones were gone from their row. In their place, near the top of the stairs, a perfect ring of bottle caps gleamed like a coined prayer. Sarah's breath built into a sound she did not recognize as her own. David reached for his phone and found only useless icons. They called her name once and again, each time farther from speech and closer to pure sound. The back door stood ajar, offering the night like a bargain. Outside, the yard had received a visitor and let the visitor go. The grass was bent where small feet had pressed. Beyond the grass, a line of trees weighted their trunks black with wet. The rain had paused just long enough to make a path. At the edge of the lawn, the earth held what the house refused to footprints spaced with the careful cadence of a child following instructions. Each print gathered a little rainwater as if cupping a secret. They led toward the trees. They did not wander. Sarah stepped into the first print. It fit under her boot the way a memory fits under a new day, still there, just smaller. David moved beside her, his flashlight convincing the dark for a few feet at a time. The beam slid over the fence. The ditch, the first line of bracken, then fractured against the trunks. Somewhere ahead, a sound shaped itself into the soft version of Emily's laugh. Not the laugh of a joke, the laugh of a child who has been promised something. Sarah felt the sound like a string tied to her ribs. She followed, not trusting her voice to carry. At the fence line, a low board had been loosened. It gaped just enough for a small body to pass. The footprints went through. On the other side, the ground sloped toward the shallow ravine that split the woods like a scar. The ravine spoke in wet, varnished murmurs. Last week's rain still ran there, slowly deciding which way to be a stream. They crossed one careful step at a time. The flashlight found a fragment of blue plastic lodged in a bramble the corner of a toy cup. Farther on, a circle of smooth stones hastily remade. The wind moved through the higher branches with the sound of a distant highway softly relentless. Above it, as if riding the wind instead of fighting it, came a smaller sound, 2 syllables of whisper that could have been a name or could have been any mother's name. At the crest beyond the ravine, Sarah stopped. The trees opened into a clearing the size of a small room. The ground was tamped smooth, as if children had played there once and never quite left. In the center, a plywood hatch lay half-buried beneath leaves twin to the trapdoor the house hid under its rug. The iron ring was new, which is to say it was not as old as everything else. David lifted the beam of light. The hatch reflected back with a dull, used gleam the way a question does when it has been answered in secret many times before. Near the hinge, a set of prints overlapped Emily's larger than a child's, smaller than a giant's ordinary, in the way the worst things often are. Sarah did not reach for the ring. She reached for the air as if the night had pockets and might return what it had taken if asked gently. The woods watched without blinking. Behind them, somewhere between the house and the clearing, a car engine turned over and settled into a patient idle. The sound carried like a reminder from town life schedule's ordinariness. In the clearing, it sounded like a man waiting. Sarah closed her eyes. She could see the corkboard, the threads, the printed face smiling beside the word deputy in a year that no longer applied. She could see the neat posture in the diner window. She could see Walter's hands turning the shears over and over as if trying to find a hinge that was not there. She opened her eyes to the clearing and found only choices. The quiet broke, then not with a crash but with a soft, decisive click, as if the woods themselves had locked a door. If you've stayed with the story this far, keep a light on for what comes next, and don't forget to subscribe. The path ahead narrows, and the truth has a way of recognizing its name when someone finally speaks it aloud. The clearing held its breath with them. Rain had rinsed the air into a hard clean, and every scent stood alone. The iron hint beneath wet bark, the quiet of fern, the faint sweetness of rotting leaves that did not apologize for returning to earth. Sarah could taste cold on her tongue. David's flashlight painted the hatch with a nervous white. Somewhere, an engine idled. The sound carried on low ground like a reminder of the ordinary world, where clocks kept polite time and people pretended not to hear what didn't suit them. Sarah knelt and set both palms on the plywood, not opening, just listening. Wood has a way of keeping stories the way bones keep weather. She felt the grain under her skin, a shallow river map of years. Beside the hinge, the prints overlapped a small foot dark with wet and a larger tread impressed just deep enough to be undeniable. She looked up at David. His jaw had learned a new angle in the last 5 minutes, as if clenched thought could push back the night. "Don't," he whispered, but the word was not an order. It was a wish spoken late. Sarah slid her fingers through the iron ring. The hatch lifted with a softened groan, the kind a house makes when someone confesses inside it. A pocket of colder air rose from below, smelling of damp earth and old metal. The beam swung down. Stairs drifted into view, rough cut and narrow edges slick with years. Something glimmered at the bottom, not light exactly, but the memory of it. She took the first step and felt the wood answer with a cautionary creak. David followed flashlight, sending the dark backward one rung at a time. The hatch settled above them, hush, returning to the clearing as if it had closed its eyes. The air tightened. The stairs delivered them into a low room, braced with timbers and careful intent. Shelving lined one wall, jars empty, now their once contents a rumor in the dust ring where lids had sealed a world. A folded lawn chair, a stack of newspapers flattened into the shape of patience. A small table with a chipped enamel cup that had known other hands. None of it screamed. All of it said this was used again and again by someone who believed he could make a place outlive its wrongness. Emily, Sarah breathed, and her voice went strange in the close space, as if her name for her child needed to learn the room before it could be allowed back to her. A rustle answered from the far corner, too quick to be vermin, too slow to be the wind, because the wind does not come here. The flashlight found a shape, a child-sized outline, curled into itself. Emily flinched against the beam, then squinted up, not frightened, only startled the way sleepers resent dawn. Sarah knelt and reached hands hovering before they dared contact. Emily leaned into her without a sound, a small anchor swinging home in a storm. David's light slid across the low ceiling and picked out something nailed into a joist, a plastic tag with numbers stamped into it, a municipal inventory marker repurposed or stolen. The beam shook. "We have to go," he said. Voice level by effort, now. Footsteps sounded overhead. Not hurried, composed. A weight crossed the hatchboards with the patient rhythm of someone who does not fear interruption. Then the iron ring knocked the wood twice, a polite announcement delivered to no one in particular. The hatch opened and framed a rectangle of darker dark. A figure paused on the top stair, then began to descend. Sheriff George Hill wore the kind of jacket that photographs well even under fluorescent lights. His face held the same public geometry Sarah had seen through the diner window, the corners arranged by practice, the eyes steady with the long investment of being believed. He reached the bottom and stood a few steps back from the beam, not wary of it, only aware that light has its own politics. "I wish you hadn't come," he said, not unkindly. "There are ways to exit a story with your dignity. This is not one of them." Sarah rose. She felt her own outline gather a contour thrown by need. David moved closer, his body learning how to be a wall. Emily held Sarah's leg and did not cry. The room had rediscovered its old function to decide what people do when rooms get small. Hill's gaze moved over the shelves, the dry sink, the chair, as if auditing his own memory. "You know the town," he said conversationally. "It wants quiet, the way a sick man wants sleep. You offer that they'll forgive a lot." He took a step forward. The flashlight steadied on his chest. "Step back," David said, but the threat bent in the air and slid off Hill's coat. Hill tilted his head as if checking for rain. "You'll tell yourselves this was about monsters," he said softly. "It's easier that way. But it's simpler. It's always simpler. Weakness. Opportunity. A lie people want to believe because it gives them permission not to ask what permission costs." He looked at Sarah as if measuring her for a door she would not fit through. Sarah felt the room contract. She thought of Walter's hands and the careful oil on the hinge. She thought of the librarian's cardigan, the paper that came out of the printer warm as breath. She thought of a boy with a jar of moths liking the sound they made when they remembered sky against glass. And then she stopped thinking because a second presence entered the room. No sound, just the sensation of space deciding to hold more than it had a moment ago. The temperature softened the way it does by a window in winter when someone closes the curtain but leaves a finger-width gap. The flashlight halo showed a brightening near the floor by the far wall, a pale stain of shape pressed gently out of the air. The figure of a child assembled there the way fog assembles along water. Neither solid nor weak, not threatening, not safe. "Timmy?" Emily's grip changed. Not tighter, closer, like a mirror correcting to the face that stands in front of it. Sarah's throat closed on a name that belonged to two children at once. Hill glanced at the brightening, and for the first time the set of his features faltered. Not fear, irritation the way a man resents a complication that refuses to be scheduled. "This part never helps," he said to the space, and it felt like he was talking about more than one room. Timmy turned his head not a swivel at deciding, and looked at Sarah the way children do who have taught themselves how to ask without speaking. A feeling traveled through her body that had nothing to do with cold, as if every bone had been reminded of its first purpose to hold. The boy lifted his hand and touched Emily's. He did not take. He aligned. Emily's breath hitched, then leveled to a rhythm Sarah remembered from the earliest nights, tiny lungs learning air. A sound above. Another set of footsteps, heavier, less careful. Then, Walter's voice taut with a courage he hadn't used in years, "I called," he said from the hatch. "You won't talk your way out of it this time." More feet. Radios. The ordinary clatter of duty, entering a story late and wanting to catch up. Hill's smile returned thinner. "You've dragged good people into a private problem," he told Sarah, and in that sentence the word "private" tried to reframe a town. His hand shifted toward his jacket, and the room's air sharpened. Timmy stepped between Hill's reach and Emily's breath. The flashlight stuttered as if the beam itself had to choose a side. Sarah moved without deciding. Her body learned a pace that lived between instinct and the years of teaching her arms to hold what mattered most as if it were breakable, because it was. She placed herself in front of Emily and faced the sheriff of a town that liked its myths ironed flat. "You will stop?" she said. The words were quiet. The room gave them a weight that did not need volume. And in the stillness after other weights arrived, the stomp of boots, the slide of authority changing hands. A deputy with a voice from another county. Someone saying "sir" in a way that meant you are not "sir" in here anymore. Metal spoke softly. Hill's jacket learned a new shape around his wrists. Walter came down the stairs, last each step taken like a promise kept at last degree. His eyes found Sarah, then the child at her leg, then the brightening near the wall. Something in his face let go with care the way a man sets down a load he has carried too far to drop. It should have ended there in the comfortable punctuation of consequence. But houses that learn certain stories do not permit tidy grammar. As Hill was guided up the stairs and the radio chatter moved out with him, the room relaxed its shoulders. In that softening, Timmy changed. He did not sharpen or blur. He leaned. Toward Emily. Toward the rhythm he had just learned again. The halo around his small shape reached like water exploring a shore. Sarah felt the pull, not violent, not kind. A gravity born of loneliness so patient it had forgotten the word for cruel because it never used it on purpose. Emily's head tipped. A shadow crossed her face that was not cast by light. Her eyes seemed to glance through her mother toward a room she had never seen and yet recognized. Sarah spoke her name gently, twice the syllables a rope that had saved them both before. Emily swayed toward the brightening, and for an instant Sarah saw both children at once like two leaves pressed thin on the same page. It was not a question of strength. It was not a contest of will. It was the kind of decision mothers make when the world puts two truths in the same small bowl and says, "Choose." Sarah knelt to Emily's height, not touching yet. She addressed the space as if speaking to a pupil who had sat the whole year in the back row and finally raised his hand. "You were hurt," she said, voice steady. "You were abandoned. You were unseen. Those are not the same as permission." The words did not accuse, they recognized. "I see you now. I will say your name where people can hear it. I will not let them fold you back into quiet." But she and her hand hovered over Emily like a roof she is mine to keep living. Timmy's outline trembled the way breath does in winter. Sarah thought of the tiny shake newborns make before sleep takes them, as if surrender and trust are cousins who must be introduced carefully. The halo gathered and drew back, not retreat, but a reshaping. It found the seam along the floor, the place Emily had circled with stones, and rested there like a small weather system deciding rain would not help today. Emily blinked and fell into Sarah's arms with the sound of a string cut free. She did not sob. The quiet she carried loosened by degrees a looseness that felt like a beginning rather than a break. David let out the breath he had kept too long and braced a hand against the wall as if the timber could tell him he had done enough for the room to hold. Upstairs, night remembered to move. There were voices at the hatch, questions promised in low tones the careful manners of law when observed by other law. Walter waited at the top and watched the stair like a farmer watches weather finally change. They climbed, the three of them, each step a new arrangement of weight. In the clearing, the dark had softened into that hour when an outline can be read as either ending or start. The trees stood less like witnesses and more like neighbors who had finally agreed to come to the fence. The engine that had idled was gone now, or had never been here, or had simply learned it no longer had a job to do in this story. Sarah looked back once. The hatch lay quiet, a mouth closed before speaking a thing it might regret. On the path, their footprints doubled and then tripled where others joined them, new weight deciding to help carry. She thought of the map on her corkboard, the threads drawn by her own hands. People would say later that everything had led here. She did not believe in lead. She believed in standing up when silence sat too long. At the fence, David lifted the loose board, and Emily ducked through with the grace of children for whom obstacles are just smaller games. On the lawn, the house waited, not welcoming, not hostile. A thing that had seen and would go on seeing. Light from the porch fell in a responsible square. The heater ticked awake inside. They stepped over the threshold. The smell of the place accepted them without judgment, as if houses like forests understand that damage and shelter often share walls. Emily's fingers found the seam of Sarah's coat and didn't let go. David locked the door because hands require a task at the end of fear. In the hallway, the objects Emily had arranged in those early days still held their measured distances. Bottle caps in a circle. Smooth stones in a small, deliberate line. Sarah knelt and moved one stone just the width of a breath, the tiniest act of editing the house would allow. Then she set it back where Emily had intended because love is not always rearrangement. Sometimes it is learned respect for the patterns that kept a child company until you arrived. She carried Emily to bed. The window latch clicked with the honest sound of a boundary closing. In the corner, shadows layered like folded quilts. For a heartbeat that had nothing to do with fear, Sarah felt watched. Not the old, watching the taking stock, the choosing. A different attention. The kind the living give the living when they have just remembered how. She sat until Emily's breath evened into a small animal's peace. The house breathed with her. Beneath the floor, a hush answered the hush, not the tense quiet of something held down, but the softer quiet of something put gently away. Later, when everyone slept except the parts of Sarah that counted and kept, she went to the corkboard and printed a single page, Timothy Collins, in a clean font below it, a date, and beneath that a line that did not ask, only named, a child who lived and was lost and will not be kept secret again. She pinned it where the red threads met not as proof but as honor. The pin slid in with a satisfying click. Morning would come with calls and reports and a town learning new shapes for its mouth. The library would unspool reels. The diner would talk carefully and then less carefully. The maple would hold through one more winter. Walter would sleep for more than an hour at a time. Some people would keep avoiding the word we when they meant it most. None of that belonged to this hour. This hour belonged to the room, the bed, the quiet that had changed its mind. Outside, the forest kept its own counsel, and somewhere between the first and second birds a small weather in the baseboard cooled and then warmed. Settling like a boy finally understanding a door is a door, and a home is a home even when it must be someone else's.